On my brother's wedding day, beneath the golden chandeliers and the thunder of applause, my father lifted his glass and praised Mark as the favorite son, the pride of our family. Then, with a laugh sharp enough to cut, he turned to me and called me the black sheep. No one there knew that for years I had carried them all. Paying the mortgage to save our home, covering my mother's hospital bills, writing checks for Mark's wedding, even hiring his lawyer after a drunk driving arrest. As 200 guests looked on, and my nephew's wide eyes searched my face, I realized I wasn't just their black sheep, I had been their lifeline. And in that moment, I decided to end the silence. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. I smoothed the skirt of my navy dress, simple and neat, while the women around me adjusted sparkling gowns and diamond bracelets. They compared boutiques on Michigan Avenue and designer heels, their voices bright. I kept my eyes on the linen napkin folded in my lap and told myself to breathe. I had written checks for almost half the expenses of this reception, but here I was, a guest in my own family's story. The MC tapped the microphone, calling for attention. My father rose slowly, champagne glass in hand, his broad shoulders filling out a tailored suit. He turned toward my brother, who stood beside Julia, his bride, their hands entwined. The crowd leaned in. Mark, my father's voice, rang through the speakers, confident, commanding my beloved son, the favorite son, the pride of the Anderson family. You are our heart, our future, our strength. Applause thundered across the ballroom. Guests whistled and called out, "Hear, hear!" Julia smiled up at him, glowing in lace and pearls. Mark grinned wider, basking in the light, his chest puffed, as if this adoration were his birthright. I clapped politely, my palms barely touching. The air around me pulsed with cheers, but I felt the heat rising in my cheeks. I thought of the florist's invoice with my name on it, the deposit for the band charged to my card, the photographer's balance I had wired weeks ago. I thought of all of it, and still this was his moment, never mine. Then my father's eyes shifted. His smile sharpened. He turned the microphone ever so slightly, pointing it toward the table where I sat. And this, he said, his voice coated with sugar that didn't hide the sting. "This is Claire, our black sheep. Always off on her own, always thinking about money instead of family." The room broke into uneven laughter. A few guests glanced at their plates. Others let out awkward chuckles, unsure whether to join in or stay silent. I froze, my hand gripping the stem of my water glass until it trembled. The cold water sloshed against the rim. I could feel eyes on me, pitying, amused, judgmental. "Sia." My cousins shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Across the room, Julia's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around Mark's. My brother stared down at his shoes, pretending not to hear. Inside me, something cracked and went still. I swallowed hard, the sound echoing in my head. I wanted to vanish into the linen tablecloth, to dissolve into the hum of the crowd. My heart thudded in my ears, drowning out the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses. Then I saw him. At the children's table, just a few feet away, my 7-year-old nephew, Ethan, had stopped fiddling with his toy car. His wide brown eyes locked on me. His mouth hung open, his face confused, almost frightened. He looked from me to his grandfather and back again, as if trying to piece together why an adult would say something so cruel, why everyone else would laugh. That look landed like a stone in my chest. My nephew didn't laugh. He didn't join the others. He simply stared, small hands clenched in his lap, waiting to understand. I forced a smile, though my lips shook. I lifted my glass slightly, a mock toast, to no one, then lowered it before anyone could notice. My breath caught, and I sat still as the band struck up another cheerful tune, the applause fading into conversation. The moment passed quickly for everyone else, but for me it etched itself into stone. The chandeliers sparkled overhead. The dance floor filled with laughter and perfume, and yet all I felt was the echo of my father's words ringing louder than the music, "Black Sheep," and my nephew's eyes, wide and unsettled, told me he had heard it too. I stayed silent, letting the noise wash over me, pretending to be invisible, while the night marched on without me. When I was 10 years old, our backyard in Evanston smelled like freshly cut grass and charcoal from someone grilling down the street. My father stood with Mr. Green, our neighbor, one hand on his hip and the other gesturing toward Mark. Best quarterback at school, he boasted loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. He's going to carry this town on his shoulders. Mr. Green nodded, impressed, his eyes moving to me where I sat on the back steps with a notebook on my knees. And your daughter? He asked politely. My father didn't even pause. She's smart, always got her nose in a book, he said flatly, then turned back to Mark. His voice lifted again, booming with pride. But Mark, he's the one with the heart, the talent. He's the one people will remember. I pressed my pencil harder against the page until the lead snapped. My cheeks burned, but neither of them noticed. Friday nights in the fall were the same story. The high school stadium lit up, the whole neighborhood, floodlights cutting through the crisp air. Mark ran onto the field, number 12 stretched across his back. My father painted the same number on his cheek, pacing the sidelines like he was the coach shouting plays that no one asked for. My mother clapped along, her voice hoarse by halftime. I sat in the bleachers alone, my algebra book open on my lap, balancing equations by the glow of the stadium lights. The roar of the crowd swelled whenever Mark touched the ball. Every time he threw a pass, my father jumped like the touchdown was his own. "Go, Mark! That's my boy!" he shouted, his voice cracking the air. People around him laughed, clapping his back. No one looked at me, hunched in my coat with a pencil smudge on my cheek. It wasn't that I resented Mark. He was my brother. He'd ruffle my hair sometimes, call me brainiac with a half smile. But I knew the truth even then. I wasn't part of the glow that followed him. I was the shadow at the edge of the field. When winter came, the cold settled deep. Christmas morning of 1997 smelled like pine needles and cinnamon rolls. The living room glittered with lights strung across the tree ornaments we'd collected since before I could remember. Mark tore through wrapping paper with a grin that stretched ear to ear. My father wheeled out a brand new BMX bike, red with chrome handlebars, the rubber tires so fresh they still had that factory shine. "Santa must have thought you were extra good this year," my dad said proudly, handing it over. Mark's face lit up as if the whole world had been delivered into his hands. Everyone clapped, even Aunt Carol, who had come in from Milwaukee. Then a small box was set on my lap. I peeled the paper carefully like Mom always told me to, revealing a worn copy of a novel I had borrowed from the library twice already. "You love to read," my mother said softly, patting my shoulder. I forced a smile. "Thank you," I whispered. The book's spine was creased, the corners bent. I ran my fingers over the cover, willing myself not to cry. Mark was already tugging on his jacket. "Dad, let's try it out!" he shouted. My father's face beamed as if he'd just given him the keys to a kingdom. Together they clattered out the front door, the cold rushing in. Relatives followed, gathering on the porch in coats and scarves, their laughter clouding the frosty air. I stayed on the couch, clutching the second-hand novel against my chest. Through the window I saw my father jogging alongside Mark, his hand steadying the handlebars as the bike wobbled down the icy street. Mark laughed, his voice carrying back to the house. My father shouted encouragement, his own laugh joining in. The porch erupted with cheers. I pressed my palm against the glass, breath fogging the window. The chill bit at my fingertips. They didn't look back, not once. Behind me, the tree lights blinked in their steady rhythm, casting shadows on the walls. The cinnamon rolls cooled on the counter, untouched. I stood there frozen, the weight of the book heavy in my arms. Tss. For the first time, I understood something I couldn't put into words yet. No matter how hard I tried, I would never shine as bright in my father's eyes as the boy riding that bike down the block. The cheers outside grew louder as Mark circled back his tires, leaving tracks in the thin layer of snow. My father clapped his hands, pride radiating off him like heat. I stepped away from the window, retreating into the corner of the couch, and opened the book. The words blurred through my tears, but I kept my eyes fixed on the page. That was the first Christmas I realized I wasn't just overlooked. I was invisible. And the silence of that truth wrapped itself around me colder than the winter air. In the fall of 2010, I packed my second-hand backpack and stepped onto the campus of Harper College in Palatine, 30 miles from the city, but a world away from the life my parents seemed to envision for Mark. I worked part-time in the library shelving books until my fingers were gray with dust and my lower back ached from lifting boxes. The paychecks were small, but every Friday I slid most of the money into an envelope and mailed it home. Mom said it helped with groceries. Dad muttered something about bills, and I convinced myself they noticed the sacrifice. Most nights I ate instant ramen in my tiny studio apartment. The steam fogged my glasses, and I scribbled numbers into a ledger I kept taped inside my notebook. Rent, gas, used, textbooks, whatever was left for food. I stretched every dollar like elastic skipping meals sometimes so I could afford the next semester's registration. My coffee was the cheapest can from the corner store brewed week, so it would last longer. Meanwhile, Mark was starting his first year at the University of Illinois. My parents loaded the family SUV with his brand new MacBook, a mini fridge, and boxes of clothes they had proudly bought on Michigan Avenue. Dad slapped his back in the parking lot, announcing to anyone within earshot that his son was destined to be an engineer. I stood off to the side, clutching a second-hand duffel bag of my own, pretending the lump in my throat was just from the August heat. By 2012, after 2 years of long shifts and high grades, I earned a transfer scholarship to Northwestern. The letter came in a crisp white envelope. I opened it alone in the campus cafeteria, the smell of stale pizza and French fries around me. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't dared to before: hope. A chance to step outside the long shadow my brother cast. The transition was overwhelming. Towering lecture halls, professors who expected you to sink or swim, students who had grown up in wealth I couldn't imagine. But numbers made sense in ways people didn't. Balance sheets spoke a language I understood. I studied until my eyes blurred, fueled by coffee and determination. I found part-time tutoring gigs, stayed late in the library, lived on peanut butter sandwiches when money ran thin. Senior year came faster than I expected. In 2014, I was named valedictorian of my class. The honor felt heavy in my hands when I got the letter, like a piece of proof that my years of sacrifice had not been in vain. I wrote my speech carefully, words about perseverance, about carving your own path when the world expected you to follow someone else's. Graduation day dawned bright and hot, the sun glaring off Lake Michigan as families streamed into the auditorium. I wore the purple gown with honors cords draped over my shoulders. My cap balanced precariously on hair I had styled myself in the mirror of my apartment. I scanned the crowd as I waited behind the stage curtain. Mom waved weakly when she spotted me. Dad already scrolling through his phone. Mark wasn't there at all. He had exams or maybe a party. I stopped asking. When my name was called, I walked to the podium, my heart pounding with both nerves and pride. The lights made the stage feel like summer heat pressing against my skin. I began to speak, voice steady. Success isn't measured by applause, I said, but by the quiet work done when no one is watching. From where I stood, I saw rows of families leaning forward, listening, clapping. Then I spotted my father in the reserved section. His head bent over his phone thumb, flicking the screen. My mother smiled politely, her hands clasping together, but her eyes kept wandering to the exit. They were already restless, already thinking about leaving. When my final words echoed through the hall, the applause that rose was polite but scattered. My parents clapped a few times, exchanged a glance, then began gathering their coats. "We need to head out," Dad whispered loudly as I stepped down from the podium as if I couldn't hear him. "Mark's got something at school tonight." I descended the stage stairs with my diploma folder clutched in both hands. The seats where they had been sitting were empty, the purple cushions still warm. The joy I had carried all through my speech dissolved in an instant, replaced by a hollow ache in my chest. I stood at the edge of the crowded gymnasium, watching other graduates fold into hugs, their families cheering and waving cameras. I held my honors certificate tight, my knuckles white, and realized no one was waiting for me. No father with a camera, no mother with tears of pride, just empty seats and the echo of footsteps leaving. It was in that moment, cap sliding forward on my head, sweat dampening my gown, that I understood something sharp and unyielding. No matter how high I climbed in my father's eyes, I would never rise above the ground Mark walked on. I left the auditorium, quietly, diploma pressed against my chest, and stepped into the blazing afternoon sun alone. In 2015, I stepped into the marble lobby of Lakeshore Bank for the first time, my new ID badge clipped neatly to my blazer. From my office on the 22nd floor, the glass wall looked out over Lake Michigan, the water stretching blue and endless. The salary was $95,000 a year, more than anyone in my family had ever made, and I signed the lease on a small apartment downtown, a one-bedroom with hardwood floors and a view of the train tracks. For the first time in my life, I felt untethered from the weight of Evanston. That illusion lasted 3 months. One night in April, Mom called, her voice low, almost embarrassed. "Claire, I hate to ask, but the hospital bills came. It's $4,000. I don't know how we'll manage." I wired the money the next morning, telling myself it was temporary, a one-time rescue. I still remember the quiet relief in her voice. "You've saved us, sweetheart." But it didn't stop. In 2016, Dad called, his voice gruff but expectant. "IRS is on me about back taxes. Just $3,000 to tide me over." He didn't phrase it as a request, more like an obligation I owed him. I sent the money, convincing myself it was the last time. By 2017, it was Mark. His car broke down outside Champaign, a beat-up Honda he claimed he needed for job interviews. He called me with his casual tone, the same one he used when asking for a soda. "It's about $2,000 for the repair. You got me right, I covered it." I always did. Each time I told myself I was being the bigger person, that once this crisis passed, I would be free to focus on my own future. But the calls kept coming. The ringtone filled me with dread. Dad's voice insistent. Mom's voice tight with worry. Mark's voice careless, like my hard work was nothing more than a bottomless well. That summer, I drove out to Evanston for the neighborhood barbecue. The air smelled of grilled burgers and sweet corn kids running barefoot across the lawn. I carried a bowl of potato salad, set it on the picnic table, and tried to blend into the chatter. Dad stood near the grill, beer in hand, talking to Mr. Green again. He gestured toward Mark, who leaned against the fence, laughing with friends. "That boy," Dad said proudly, "he's really come into his own. Fixed his car himself last month. Shows responsibility." The words hit me like a stone. My hand trembled around the serving spoon. I looked at Mark. He nodded along, let the lie stand, grinned as if he had actually paid that mechanic. I wanted to speak, to say I sent the check. I covered the bill. The words rose in my throat, but caught there, blocked by years of silence. Instead, I stayed quiet, standing by the salad, my fingers trembling so hard I almost dropped the spoon. A few neighbors clapped Dad on the back, congratulating him for raising such a capable son. I turned away, staring at the kids chasing fireflies, my chest tightening. The laughter of the party carried over me, but I couldn't hear it. For the first time, I felt something deeper than invisibility. I felt erased. When I drove back to the city that night, headlights cutting through the darkness of the Kennedy Expressway, the weight of it pressed on me. My sacrifices weren't just unseen. They were being rewritten as someone else's victories. I unlocked my apartment, dropped my keys on the counter, and sat at the small kitchen table. I pulled out my notebook and listed the numbers. $4,000 for Mom, $3,000 for Dad, $2,000 for Mark. $9,000 gone in less than 2 years. I wrote the words slowly across the page, "Bank of Claire," and beneath it, "Balance nearly empty." The pen dug into the paper as I pressed harder, the ink bleeding. My reflection in the window looked back at me, tired, worn, and very much alone. By the spring of 2019, the phone calls from home came with a different weight. My mother's voice cracked through the line, trembling with something I hadn't heard before. "Fear. Claire," she whispered, "the bank keeps calling. If we don't get caught up, they'll take the house. Your father, He won't admit it, but Anderson Construction is done. He can't cover the taxes. We're drowning. I drove up to Evanston the next weekend, the streets still dusted with dirty snow salt stains crusted along the curbs. At the kitchen table, I found my father hunched forward, his face buried in his hands. Papers were spread out across the surface. Final notices, IRS letters, red numbers circled in ink. $55,000 in back taxes stared at me in bold print. He looked up when I stepped in, his eyes, bloodshot, his jaw set. "It wasn't my fault," he muttered, stabbing a finger at the top page. The client pulled out, "How do you plan for that one bad break and the whole job collapses?" I wanted to say that real businesses had contingency plans, that smart men didn't gamble everything on one contract. But the words lodged in my throat. He didn't want advice. He wanted rescue. That night back in my apartment, I opened my online banking. I had saved $8,000 in a separate account, a cushion I had built over years of skipped vacations and takeout dinners. My spring bonus had just hit, $7,000 more, $15,000 in total. It was supposed to be the down payment on a condo in Lakeview, the first place that would be mine alone. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, then wired the money in 3 transfers. By morning, my account balance looked like a body after surgery, gutted, empty, hollow. A week later, my parents threw a small family gathering. The dining room smelled of roast beef and wine. Laughter floated through the house, though beneath it I felt the tightness of desperation still clinging to the walls. When dinner ended, my father rose with his glass, his chest puffed like nothing had ever broken him. "We had a scare," he announced, but I held the line. "The bank tried to push us, but I kept this house in our name." "That's what you do for family, you fight." Cousins and aunts clapped, some raising their glasses high. My mother smiled weakly, eyes darting to me for a fleeting second, then away. Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking, accepting congratulations, as if he had contributed something. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, my fork idle against the plate. Not one word about the money I had drained from my own future to keep a roof over their heads. Not a glance of acknowledgement from the man soaking in applause. The sound of glasses clinking was deafening. In the middle of the noise, I pulled my phone under the table and opened the Notes app. My fingers trembled as I typed, "Bank of Clare. Balance 0. I slid the phone back into my purse, my throat burning. Around me, the party continued, filled with laughter and stories, but I felt like a ghost in my parents' house. My father beamed at Mark as though he had inherited the world. That night, when the guests left and the driveway emptied, I lingered in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel. Through the front window, I saw my father still animated, retelling his victory to whoever remained in the kitchen. The glow of the chandelier framed him like a man who had conquered a war. I turned the ignition, the engine humming low, and whispered into the empty car, "You didn't save anything." I did. The words dissolved into the dark as I pulled onto the street. Headlights, sweeping past the familiar houses of my childhood. For the first time, I wondered how much of myself I would lose before they ever admitted the truth. By the end of 2019, the Anderson family had a new storyline to boast about. Mark met Julia Bennett at a barbecue hosted by mutual friends, and by Christmas, they were engaged. Julia was sweet, dependable, the kind of woman who baked cookies for neighbors and sent thank you cards. She believed she was marrying into stability, into a family that had weathered storms, but stood strong. No one told her the cracks beneath the surface were wide enough to swallow her whole. When talk of the wedding began, Julia suggested a modest celebration at a restaurant in Oakbrook. $10,000 total. Manageable, intimate something within reach. I thought maybe this time for once sanity would prevail. But my father puffed out his chest and shook his head. "Andersons don't do small," he declared. "This is a legacy event. It needs to be remembered." Mark grinned, soaking up the pride, and quickly agreed. Within a month, the plans shifted from a family-style dinner to a ballroom dripping in chandeliers. The budget tripled. Every conversation added another $1,000. Flowers band, open bar crystal centerpieces. Suddenly, the price tag was $28,000, and Julia looked overwhelmed but too polite to push back. I raised my voice carefully during one planning meeting, my tone even. Do we really need the ballroom? You could save a lot with the restaurant option. Julia seemed happy with that. Mark waved me off. Come on, Claire, this is my one big day. Don't be negative. My father leaned forward. Your brother deserves to be celebrated properly. He's the face of this family. A week later, my mother called me privately. Her voice was soft, hesitant. Sweetheart, we're stretched thin. The deposits are due. Just help a little for your brother. He deserves this day. I pinched the bridge of my nose, staring at the condo listings I'd bookmarked, places in Lakeview with balconies overlooking the lake. My down payment fund sat in my account, nearly enough for one of them. Instead, I transferred $14,000 across 3 separate checks. Florist, band, photographer. Each receipt bore my name, though no one would ever see it. The night I signed the last check, I sat alone at my small dining table, the glow of my laptop illuminating the property listings I had to close. The apartment with the white-tiled kitchen and the one with the bay window I loved. They slipped away with every wire transfer. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the L train rattling my windows. For the first time, I said the words out loud. I'm buying their happiness and selling my future to do it. The realization left me hollow. I had told myself for years that the sacrifices were temporary, that once they stabilized, I could finally build something of my own. But this wasn't temporary. It was a pattern, a cycle that grew heavier with every check. The next weekend, I visited home for a wedding tasting. The caterer served samples of filet mignon and scallops wrapped in bacon dishes I knew Mark couldn't afford if he worked 3 jobs. My father clapped the caterer's back, saying, "Nothing but the best for my son." Mark beamed. Julia tried to smile, and I sat there chewing food. I had essentially paid for swallowing bitterness with every bite. Afterward, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway of the banquet hall. I dialed David, my boyfriend at the time, and when he answered, my voice broke. It's like I'm their wallet, not their daughter. There was a pause on the other end. Then his calm voice. You're allowed to say no, Claire. But I couldn't. Not then. Driving back to the city, I passed through neighborhoods with rows of condos' lights glowing in windows that could have been mine. I pictured myself curled on a couch by a balcony door, books stacked neatly, a life that was my own. Instead, my money was tied up in rented chandeliers and a one-night party that would be forgotten by most of the guests before the year was out. That night, I walked into my apartment, dropped my purse on the floor, and sat by the window looking out at the skyline I loved. The lights of downtown sparkled like something just out of reach. My chest felt tight, as if a piece of my dream had been stripped away. For the first time, I admitted to myself what I had been avoiding for years. This wasn't just generosity. This was theft of my life by the people who were supposed to protect it. And I was the one handing it over willingly. I pressed my forehead against the glass, breathing in the cold, seeping through the pain, and whispered, "Something has to change." But deep down I knew nothing would. Not yet. The wedding machine was already rolling forward, and I was chained to it, one more check at a time. The call came in the middle of the night, sharp and insistent, pulling me from sleep. I fumbled for the phone, my heart pounding, as I saw my father's name flashing on the screen. "Claire," he said, his voice tight and breathless. "Mark's been arrested. DUI. They're holding him. We need a lawyer right now." I sat up, the cold seeping in from the window. Snowflakes swirled under the streetlight outside the city, blanketed in silence. "What do you mean arrested?" My voice cracked, the fog of sleep evaporating. He blew over the limit. "They want to arraign him in the morning. A good attorney will cost $9,000. You can handle that, right?" 9,000. The exact amount I had been saving for a long-promised vacation, a week by the ocean where I thought I could breathe. I pressed my palm against my forehead, the pressure building behind my eyes. "Dad, it's your brother," he cut me off, his tone hardening. "He made a mistake, but he deserves another chance. Don't let him be punished for one night of poor judgment." The guilt slid in like a knife, sharp and familiar. I exhaled shakily, staring at the frost forming along the window pane. "I'll take care of it," I whispered. 2 weeks later, I sat on a wooden bench inside Cook County Courthouse, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Mark shuffled in his shirt, wrinkled his tie crooked. His eyes were bloodshot hands shaking as he shoved them into his pockets. The lawyer I had hired stood beside him, briefcase polished, arguments rehearsed. I watched them confer quietly, bile rising in my throat, knowing the entire defense was paid for with my savings. When the judge entered the room hushed, papers shuffled, the charges were read. Driving under the influence, endangering others, the prosecutor laid out the evidence, the breathalyzer results, the reckless swerving. I gripped my purse tighter, my knuckles white. The lawyer did his job well. Too well. He painted Mark as a hard-working man under stress, a family man who had slipped just once. He talked about potential, about rehabilitation. He never mentioned the drinking binges, the jobs Mark had quit, the years of irresponsibility. The gavel came down with a sentence, 12 months probation license suspended, no jail time, a slap on the wrist for what could have been tragedy. I looked at Mark, expecting relief, maybe gratitude. He only smirked faintly, like he had dodged something inevitable. My father clapped him on the shoulder the moment they stepped into the hallway. "See, you'll bounce back. This is nothing but a stumble. You'll be stronger for it." Relatives who had gathered outside nodded, offering pats on the back, words of encouragement. They ignored me completely, the woman standing in the corner with an empty bank account and a pounding headache. Uncle Frank leaned against the wall, his police badge long retired, but his eyes still sharp. He caught my gaze, shook his head slowly, and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "You keep bailing him out. He'll never grow up." I swallowed hard, unable to answer. The truth of it stung more than the money lost. That night, back in my apartment, the city lights flickered against the dark lake. I cleared a spot on my kitchen table, opened my worn ledger, and wrote down the new figure. 4,000 for Mom, 3 for Dad, 2 for Mark's car, 15 for the mortgage, 14 for the wedding, 9 for the lawyer. The numbers bled together until they blurred. I added them carefully, the pen scratching against the paper. Over $60,000. Gone. The tears came hot and sudden, smearing the ink. My hands shook as I forced myself to write the words I had been avoiding, Bank of Clare. Nearly drained. I stared at the page, the letters swimming in front of me. My chest felt hollow, my lungs shallow. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the city in silence, while inside I sat alone, counting the cost of love that never seemed to reach me in return. By the end of 2021, the office at Lakeshore Bank felt like a pressure cooker. I spent 12-hour days buried in spreadsheets and presentations for a massive corporate client that could make or break my shot at senior VP. My monitor glowed long after the rest of the floor went dark, and my reflection in the glass wall showed the hollow under my eyes, the tension carved into my shoulders. One morning, as I passed the break room, I caught fragments of whispers. 2 analysts leaned against the counter, voices low but not low enough. "She's been pulling out so much cash," one said. "Must be drowning in debt." The other laughed softly. "Figures. You can't work that hard without something falling apart." I didn't stop. I didn't confront them. I just kept walking, coffee burning in my hand, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Bus." Their words followed me back to my desk, cutting deeper than they should have because they weren't entirely wrong. Later that afternoon, my supervisor Kelly asked me into her office. She didn't mention money, didn't ask about rumors. She sat with her hands folded and her voice measured. "Claire, this project is critical. I need you fully here. Whatever's going on outside these walls, you can't let it pull you off track. Do you understand?" I nodded, swallowing the knot in my throat. Yes, I understand. I walked back to my desk, the city stretching behind the glass, its lights starting to flicker on as the sky dimmed. My phone buzzed. Another missed call from my father. I turned it face down and kept typing, fingers stiff, trying to bury myself in the numbers. That night I came home to the scent of garlic and rosemary. David was at the stove, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, stirring a pot of pasta sauce like it was his courtroom. He looked up and smiled, but the smile faded when he saw me drop my bag heavily by the door and sink into a chair. "You didn't eat lunch again, did you?" he asked. I shook my head. "Too busy." He carried 2 plates to the table, poured glasses of red wine, and sat across from me. For a while we ate in silence, the clink of forks against ceramic filling the quiet. I avoided his eyes, staring at the steam rising from the food. Finally, he set his fork down. "Claire, we need to talk." I stiffened, bracing myself. "You're not living your life anymore. You're a bank account with a heartbeat. Every time they call, you open your wallet. Every time they stumble, you carry them. You don't even stop to ask if you can afford it. Not financially, not emotionally." His voice was calm but firm, like when he dissected a case in court. I forced a laugh that sounded brittle even to me. "They're my family, David. What do you expect me to do? Say no when my mom calls crying? Let my dad lose the house? Let Mark crash and burn?" He leaned forward, his eyes steady on mine. "Families are supposed to love you, not bleed you dry. There's a difference between helping and being used. Right now, you're being used, and you're letting it happen." The words hit me like a slap, because I had thought them myself in the quiet moments I never admitted out loud. I stared at my plate, appetite gone. The images came unbidden, the red BMX bike gleaming in the snow, my father's toast at graduation, the empty seats in the auditorium, the checks I had signed for weddings and lawyers and taxes, every sacrifice I had made erased, rewritten as someone else's triumph. "I don't know how to stop," I whispered finally. David reached across the table, his hand warm over mine. "You start by saying no once, and then you keep saying it until they understand. You deserve a life, Claire. You deserve more than this." "Oh." I nodded, but my chest tightened. Saying no felt impossible, like betraying the people who raised me. And yet a small voice inside me, the same voice that had grown louder with every check, echoed his words. After he went to bed, I sat alone on the couch, laptop open to my bank account. The numbers glared back at me, stark and unkind. I scrolled through the list of transfers, mortgage taxes, medical bills, car repairs, wedding deposits, DUI lawyer. Line after line of withdrawals, all in my name. The balance sat low, far lower than it should have been after years of promotions and long nights at the office. My reflection in the dark screen looked tired, worn, almost unrecognizable. For the first time, I admitted to myself what I had denied for so long. David was right. I wasn't living. I was financing. I closed the laptop, pressed my palms against my eyes, and let the silence of the apartment settle heavy around me. The argument between Mark and Julia had been building for months, but when it finally broke open in early 2022, it sounded like glass shattering. Julia called me one evening, her voice shaking. "I can't stay there anymore, Claire. I need to get out for a while, find someplace stable." She paused before adding, "I'll leave Ethan with Mark for a few weeks. At least he'll have his father, and your parents live close. They'll keep an eye." I didn't argue. Maybe I should have. The next Friday, I drove up to Evanston after work, headlights cutting through the winter dark. The house looked dim from the street, no lights in the front windows. Curtains drawn tight. I knocked once, then again harder. When the door swung open, the smell hit me first. Beer, cigarettes, the stale sourness of neglect. My brother lay sprawled on the couch, an arm hanging over the side, empty cans littering the carpet. The TV flickered with static. His chest rose and fell in heavy, uneven breaths. "Yeah." "Mark," I said sharply. No response. I shook his shoulder. He groaned, rolled onto his side, and muttered something incoherent before sinking deeper into sleep. "Ethan." My voice softened. From the corner of the room, a small figure stirred. My nephew sat curled in a ball on a threadbare armchair, a thin blanket wrapped around him. His eyes were swollen, his cheeks red. He looked at me startled, then whispered, "Aunt Claire." I dropped to my knees in front of him. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." I pulled him into my arms. His body chilled through the fabric of his pajamas. His hands were icy against my neck. I held him tighter, anger burning hot under my skin. "Did you eat dinner?" I asked. He shook his head. In the kitchen, I found nothing but half a bottle of ketchup, a carton of expired milk, and a stale box of crackers. I dug through cabinets until in the back I found one last packet of instant oatmeal. I boiled water in a dented kettle, stirring the thin oats in a chipped bowl, while Ethan sat at the table, eyes heavy with exhaustion. He ate slowly, spoon clinking against the ceramic. "It's okay," he said quietly, as though he didn't want me to feel bad. "Dad said he was tired." I forced a smile. "You just eat honey." Later, I tucked him into his bed, layering every blanket I could find. He clutched a worn stuffed bear against his chest. His eyelids fluttered heavy from fatigue, but he kept glancing toward the doorway. "You won't leave, will you?" My throat tightened. "No. I'm right here." I sat on the edge of the bed until his breathing evened his small face finally at peace. The front door opened around 9. My father's booming voice filled the house. "Mark, where's my boy?" He strode in, coat dusted with snow, eyes scanning the living room. He spotted his son slumped on the couch, shook him awake with a laugh, and pulled him into a rough embrace. "One rough patch doesn't define you. You'll get back on your feet. You're still my pride, my favorite son." I stepped into the doorway, fury bubbling in my chest. "Dad, look at him. He's drunk. He can't even keep his eyes open. Ethan hasn't eaten all day." My father brushed me off, still focused on Mark. "He just needs time. Don't be so harsh." I wanted to scream. Instead, I bit down on the words, the bitterness pooling at the back of my throat. He didn't see Ethan's hollow cheeks. He didn't smell the staleness in the air. All he saw was the son he'd built his pride around, no matter how far he fell. When the house grew quiet again, I went back to Ethan's room. He was asleep, his breath soft and steady lashes resting on his pale skin. I sat in the darkness watching him, my chest rising and falling with his. I whispered into the stillness words meant only for him. "I won't let you be left behind, not like me. Not again." And for the first time in years, the determination hardened in me like steel. Something had to change. I wouldn't watch another child carry the same weight of being invisible. The ballroom at Oakbrook shimmered with gold light, the chandeliers scattering it across sequined dresses and polished shoes. Waiters moved quickly between tables, the clink of glasses blending with laughter and camera shutters. Julia glowed in her gown veil, trailing behind her as she leaned into Mark's arm, and for a moment it looked like the picture-perfect wedding I had paid half of. I sat at the far edge, my fingers clenched tight around my phone, watching from a distance like I had always done. My dress suddenly felt too plain under the glittering lights, my seat too far from the people who bore my last name. The phone was slick in my palm, a cold reminder of the proof I carried. When the MC handed the microphone to my father, the chatter softened into silence. He stood tall, glass of champagne in one hand, his smile wide. He lifted the glass high toward the head table. "My son, Mark," he began, his voice booming, the favorite son, the pride and the heart of this family. "Today we celebrate not just a marriage, but the man he has become." Applause erupted, echoing off the walls. Some guests whistled, others cheered. Julia beamed at her new husband, eyes glistening with tears. Mark soaked in the praise, chin lifted, shoulders squared as though he truly believed every word. Then my father turned his eyes, sweeping the room before landing on me. His tone shifted, still smooth, but laced with something sharp. "And here," he said, gesturing with his glass, "is Claire, our black sheep, always keeping her distance, always counting dollars instead of memories." The laughter started small, nervous at first, then rippled through pockets of the room. A few guests lowered their eyes, uncomfortable. Others leaned closer to whisper. My stomach twisted, heat rushing into my face. I stood before I even realized my legs had moved. The scrape of my chair against the floor cut through the murmurs. My heart pounded, but my voice came out steady. "Let me tell you what those dollars have counted." The room fell quiet. Forks froze midair. All eyes turned toward me. I opened the banking app on my phone, the glow bright against my hand. In 2019, I covered the mortgage. $7,000. In 2020, I paid for Mom's hospital bills. $10,000. In 2021, I covered wedding deposits. Flowers band photographer, $14,000. That same year, when Mark was arrested for a DUI, I paid for the lawyer, $9,000. The silence thickened, broken only by the faint clatter of a spoon against porcelain. I lifted my head, meeting my father's stunned expression. In total, $72,000. Out of my pocket. Out of the life I've been trying to build. Julia's face paled, her mouth falling open. Mark dropped his gaze to the table, his jaw tight, the tips of his ears red. My father froze, glass still raised the color draining from his cheeks. I let the silence hang. Then I said the words that had lived inside me for years. The Bank of Clare is closed. I lowered my phone and sat back down. My hands shook, but my chest felt strangely light. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I simply told the truth. Around me, conversations faltered into hushed tones. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some staring, some pretending to look anywhere but at me. The band stopped mid-note, the music dying into the heavy air. My wine glass stood untouched before me, the condensation dripping onto the linen. I traced a finger along the rim, the world around me fractured and silent. Across the room, Julia pulled her hand from Mark's, her smile gone. My father stared at me as if I had struck him, unable to move or speak. The ballroom moments earlier, filled with applause and laughter, now held only the weight of truth. And in that silence, for the first time, I didn't feel erased. I felt seen. After the wedding, the whispers spread faster than spilled wine. Colleagues of my parents, distant cousins, even neighbors I hadn't seen in years. Everyone seemed to know the story. At the grocery store, someone leaned in and murmured to my mother, "I heard your daughter's been carrying the whole family." At church, guests from the wedding looked at my father differently. Their polite nods thinner, their conversations shorter. For once, the spotlight my father had always craved turned harsh. Within months, Julia filed for divorce. She told me privately over coffee in a small cafe in Oakbrook, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands wrapped tight around the cup. "I can't do it anymore, Claire. He won't change. I need to protect Ethan. The custody battle was brutal." Mind. Mark showed up to hearings disheveled, his words slurred, his promises empty. Julia came prepared with documents, schedules, testimony from teachers. In the end, Ethan stayed primarily with her, though he still visited my parents on weekends. Mark was ordered into rehab, the judge's voice sharp with finality. Watching him shuffle out of that courtroom, his head down, I felt no triumph, just exhaustion. My father, stripped of his bravado, finally took day labor on construction sites. I drove past once, and there he was bent over with a shovel in his hands, sweat staining his collar. The man who once commanded crews now followed orders, barked by younger men. He didn't see me in the car, but I saw him. Small, diminished, no longer untouchable. My mother took evening shifts at a discount store, clipping coupons at the kitchen table under the yellow glow of a single lamp. Her voice on the phone grew thinner, worn by years of stretching every dollar. "We'll be okay," she would say, but I could hear the fatigue in every syllable. By the spring of 2023, the Evanston house wore its weariness openly paint-peeling, gutters sagging, a for sale sign stabbed into the front lawn. I drove past on my way to work one morning, the sight hitting me harder than I expected. That house had been the stage for my invisibility, my sacrifices, my silence, and now it was being sold at a loss, a symbol of everything they refused to face until it was too late. When they moved into a cramped apartment near the train tracks, the shift was undeniable. No manicured lawns, no proud porch light burning late into the night, just the rattle of passing trains and the weight of downsizing. One evening that summer, my phone rang as I sat in my high-rise apartment downtown, the city lights stretching across the lake. My mother's voice broke through, fragile and raw. "Claire," she said, pausing as though the words were heavy, "you were never the black sheep. You've always been the backbone. We just couldn't see it." I pressed the phone to my ear, staring out at the glittering skyline. My throat tightened, tears blurring the view. For years I had waited, aching for acknowledgement, even a sliver of truth. And now, at last, it came. Not from my father, not from Mark, but from the one person who still had the courage to say it aloud. I didn't answer right away. I just let the silence hold us, my chest rising and falling with the weight of her confession. The city pulsed beneath me, trains rumbling in the distance while I sat there with tears sliding down my face, the ache of decades softening just slightly. For the first time I felt the faint shift of balance, like the world had tilted enough for me to finally breathe. By 2025, the pieces of my life finally aligned into something steady, something I could claim as my own. Lakeshore Bank announced my promotion to senior vice president that spring, and the office that once felt like a cage now felt like proof of survival. My nameplate on the glass door gleamed in the morning sun, and for the first time I felt I had earned a place no one could take from me. At home, David and I shared a condo overlooking Lake Michigan. From the balcony I could see the waves cresting against the shoreline, the lights of Navy Pier blinking at night. David's case files often lay stacked on the dining table, my laptop open beside them, our separate worlds humming together in quiet harmony. He cooked most evenings, and I finally allowed myself to eat without the knot of guilt that used to sit in my stomach. Ethan was 10 now, taller and stronger, his laughter echoing in our apartment on weekends when he came to stay. He brought over his homework, sometimes sprawled on the rug, while I quizzed him on multiplication tables. Other times we walked along the lakefront, his hand slipping into mine as he told me stories about school and friends. Once, after I helped him finish a science project, he hugged me tight and said, "You're my lifesaver, Aunt Claire." I held him longer than I should have, my chest swelling with something close to relief. Meanwhile, my parents' world had shrunk. My father's hands grew rough and calloused from years of construction work. The man who once puffed his chest and spoke like a king now stooped under the weight of shovels and cement bags. When he looked at me, the arrogance was gone, replaced with something quieter. Maybe shame, maybe respect. My mother still clipped coupons. Her hair streaked with gray, her voice softer when she called. She no longer asked for money. Instead, she asked how I was doing. I visited them sometimes in their small apartment near the tracks. The rumble of passing trains shook the windows, a constant reminder of the life they now lived. My father would sit at the table silent, sipping weak coffee, while my mother talked about the weather or Ethan's latest drawing. The words "favorite son" never left his mouth again. One evening after dinner, I caught my father watching me across the table. His eyes lingered a moment longer than usual, and for the first time in my life, he didn't look at me with disdain. There was no toast, no public declaration, just a flicker of acknowledgement. It was enough. Back at my condo, I often sat by the window as the sun set over Chicago, the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple. The city glowed beneath me, alive and restless. But in those quiet moments, I let myself remember. I thought of every word, every laugh, every time I was dismissed as the black sheep. The label had once felt like a curse, a brand I couldn't wash away, but now, looking out at the skyline I had built my own life against, I understood it differently. If being the black sheep meant I was the one who walked away from blind loyalty, who saved myself when no one else would, then I would wear it proudly. The black sheep had survived. The black sheep had thrived. I smiled into the fading light, the reflection in the glass no longer tired, no longer erased. And I want to ask you, have you ever been called the black sheep in your family? Have you found the strength to turn that label into something powerful? Share your story with me. I'd like to know how you found your own way.